Hello everyone, Silent K here, and welcome to some more card reviews. Before we get started, a quick correction from the last video. Thief, I rated an overall of +1. I'm going to have to change that to a 0. When I'm putting together the review for a card, there's a few steps involved, and one of those is to compare cards at the same cost, and also to compare cards with the same utility, to see what they compete with. So when I was comparing utility, I immediately went to Mage Leader because they were both the same sort of draw a card for low mana cost. And somewhere along the line I forgot that Thief was 3 mana while Mage Leader is 2. Also, there was confirmation that Clash only triggers upon follower combat. It does not trigger if you attack the leader. So I kind of looked at Thief in a better light than it really should have been. So overall, not as good as the version I had in my head when I was reviewing it. Second thing real quick is I added a Timmy value to a few cards in the last video, and I didn't really explain what that was. I'm not going to waste time explaining it, but if you're unfamiliar with Magic the Gathering terms, I'll put a slide on the screen so you can pause the video and read it. So let's take a look at the new cards. First up for Bloodcraft, Sadistic Knight, 3 mana spell, deal 2 damage to your leader, deal 6 damage to an enemy follower. Enhance 7, then summon a Beast Dominator. 6 damage for 3 mana is great value. Deal 2 damage to your leader is pretty standard, and of course it has synergy with Mary combos. And the enhanced effect basically gives you a 4/6 for 4 mana, unless you're in Vengeance. Or if you evo it right away, you get an 8/8, which is pretty good value. On the minus side, for aggro decks this can't hit face, so it might not be better than Razor Claw, but on the plus side for aggro decks, it does kill a turn 3 Ancient Elf, which can be troublesome. So I could see this replacing Razor Claw in some decks, or maybe even Night Horde if you're running a Bloodcraft deck without bats. Overall score +1. Next, Flood Behemoth, 6 mana 4/4, Clash, deal 1 damage to all enemy followers. This is basically Harness Glass on steroids, but still only with a 1 damage AoE. I do like teching in Harness Glass for anti-aggro, and AoE is usually pretty good, even if it is only 1 damage. But slower Bloodcraft decks usually run a lot of AoE, including multiple copies of Revelation and sometimes Demonic Storm. I'm not really sure if it will fit into those types of decks, but on its own it's just a pretty solid card. Give it a rating of 0. And lastly we have Vania's very own brother, Vite, or Vate, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Vampire Noble, 3 mana 3/2 with Ward, Clash, summon a Forest Bat. This is basically sometimes a better Killer Devil. Instead of a 2/1 and a 1/1, you get a 3/2 with Ward that might summon a 1/1. The Clash effect isn't likely to go off multiple times. He's nowhere near as flashy or as effect-filled as his sister, but he is a pretty solid card. Overall score of 0. On to Dragoncraft, Legendary, 9 mana 5/5. Fanfare, discard your hand and deal X damage to all enemies. X equals the number of cards discarded. On the minus side, Dragoncraft usually discards whenever it draws, so it's hard for Dragon to put together a big hand. On the plus side, you get a pretty solid one-sided AoE, but on the minus side, the discard effect makes this more of a finisher than an AoE, because you're not going to have any cards in your hand afterwards. But on the plus side, if you're playing a discard Dragon deck, you will refill your hand because you will have a Dracomancer's Rights on the board. But that's assuming discard Dragoncraft has enough support in this expansion to become a fully realized deck. This does mostly solve one of the problems I had with discard Dragoncraft when I was thinking about it during the Darkness Evolved expansion. I said that the 2 things it really needed was more manual procs for discard effects, like Dragon Newt's Fist, and the other thing it really needed was some sort of endgame plan. Cycling through your deck like mad is great and all, but without an endgame plan it's kind of pointless. So some kind of big impact card like this is what discard Dragoncraft needs. But I think it's still lacking some support. So overall this is going to be a 0, but it could be a +1 in the future if discard Dragoncraft becomes a thing. Draconic Fervor, 5 mana spell, gain an empty playpoint orb, draw 2 cards, and restore 3 health to your leader. This is a nice little collection of effects, and it does have the rare straight up card draw, and the rare heal effect. Dragoncraft doesn't really have much access to those effects, but on the minus side this becomes a lot less useful the further away from turn 5 you get. And an expensive card draw card you can't always expect to play on turn 5. Sometimes your opponent is applying too much pressure and you have to hold off until they give you a slow turn. So in some cases Dragon Council is going to be better than this. Overall though, pretty nice card. We'll give it a +1. On to Forestcraft. Mahis, 6 mana 5/5 with Ward. Fanfare, deal 2 damage to all enemies if at least 2 other cards were played this turn. As if dealing 2 damage to all enemies wasn't enough, this card also needed Ward, I guess. The only thing keeping this from being a +2 is that it comes in around the same turn Cynthia does, so it does have some competition for the slot. Although if you do have a more control-oriented Forestcraft, the AoE install will be a little more beneficial than the bonuses that Cynthia gives, since she's more of a mid-range finisher. So overall, pretty good card, +1. Next up, Jesus Christ, we can't show that on YouTube. 1 mana Entangling Vines. Alright. She's just entangled with the vines, we're fine. Never mind. Carrying on. 1 mana spell, Entangling Vines. Give an enemy follower a -10, -0 until the end of the turn. Enhance 5, destroy it instead. The 1 mana version is a little bit awkward, but it does combo with Crystallia Tia, Rhinoceroach, or Evos. You can reduce pretty much anything to 0 attack, and then attack it with Crystallia Eve or Rhinoceroach and destroy the minion and not take any damage on that minion, which is pretty useful because every once in a while a forest deck will run Woodkin Curse, and then you're forced to trade into it with your Roach, and then you lose your Roach. With this you can buff up your Roach, smash it into the minion, remove it, and then bounce your Roach back nice and safe, 0 damage. But on the minus side, the 1 mana version doesn't do anything permanent if you don't follow up on the threat. So it's a combo card before 5 mana, and it's a basic card removal after 5 mana. Overall, 0. Next up for Havencraft, Veteran Tamer. 4 mana 2/3, Fanfare, summon a Beastly Vow. Beastly Vow is, of course, the 2 mana amulet that summons a 4/4 Holy Flame Tiger, with countdown 2. This has okay value. You get the 2 mana Beastly Vow and then basically a 2/3 for 2, but Haven doesn't really play many 4s aside from Priest of the Cudgel, and the Beastly Vow amulet will pop on turn 6, which means if you have to Nephthys Decree, you just played a 4 mana 2/3. So while Haven could use a new 4-drop, this one isn't exactly spectacular. I'm going to give it an overall 0. I don't even think it's really worth 0, but if you had a limited collection and you had to fill it out, like, this isn't particularly bad value, so we'll go with 0. Next, Valhalla General, 6 mana 3/3. Fanfare, give an allied follower +3/+3 and rush. So put it all together and it's basically a 6/6 rush for 6, but on the minus side it's unplayable without a follower on board. Now that doesn't seem too bad since Haven has the amulets which usually protect their things, so you could use this on a freshly popped amulet, but it is functionally similar to Garuda while being a lot more restrictive. So overall -1, mainly just because Garuda exists. Next up, Tribunal of Good and Evil, a 4 mana amulet, countdown 3, Fanfare, destroy a random enemy follower. Last words, destroy a random enemy follower. I am probably going to get a lot of flack for this, but I don't think this is a good card. As someone who plays a self-made Concede Haven deck built around removing minions every single turn, I wouldn't even put this in my deck. It's worse than Death Sentence in almost every case. While Death Sentence can be used for immediate removal when comboed with any countdown reduction, or it can be used to buy a turn by just placing it on the board, and your opponent isn't likely to play 3 or more minions just to keep something on the board, they would usually just pass turn instead. This one is inflexible. Since it's a one-trick pony, it destroys something and then it destroys something later. You can affect the countdown, but the denial isn't anywhere near as good as Death Sentence. Your opponent is likely to play 3 or more minions in order to avoid the last words of this amulet, unlike Death Sentence. The only minor denial is that your opponent can't play just one single large follower for the next 3 turns, because they will anticipate you have countdown reduction and they won't want it to be removed. But aside from that, this is a one-trick pony version of Death Sentence. I'm going to have to give it an overall score of -1. On to Runecraft, Professor of Taboos, 6 mana 3/5. Whenever an enemy follower is destroyed during your turn, summon a zombie. At the end of your turn, perform Earthright, destroy a random enemy follower. This guy has 2 powerful effects packed onto his card, and he has a repeatable Earthright effect. Now I'm no Earthright Runecraft expert, but just on pure value, I'm going to give it an overall rating of +1. Next up, Clark, Arcane Scholar, 3 mana 2/3. Fanfare, spell boost the followers in your hand 2 times. This is exactly the same as Craig, Wizard of Mysterio, we looked at in the last video. And much like Craig, this is an interesting effect for a deck that doesn't exist yet. So if we see a minion-based spell boost deck appear, Clark will be useful in it, but until then, he doesn't really have a place in existing decks. Even in such a deck, he would just be a 2-3 for 3 with the spell boost effect, so overall score is 0. On to Shadowcraft. Voices of Resentment, 3 mana spell, summon 2 ghosts. Enhance 8, give the summoned ghosts Bane. This card seems very underwhelming to me. It does generate a shadow instead of consuming them, the way Phantom Howl does, but 3 mana for 2 damage is pretty poor value, and for 8 mana spending your entire turn removing 2 threats is usually just stalling, unless the specific situation happens to be that 2 wards are blocking lethal. This card might have potential at some point, but right now the overall score will be -1, just because I don't see it fitting into any deck, and it seems to be poor value. Next, Ghostly Grasp. 1 mana spell, destroy an enemy follower with 1 defense. If you have enough shadows, you can choose to use Necromancy 8 to destroy an enemy follower with 2 defense or more instead. This is the 3rd weird removal for Shadowcraft in this expansion so far. Packed with the Nether God, Voices of Resentment, and now Ghostly Grasp. On the plus side though, this one seems to be pretty good. On the minus side, it's a binary Angelic Snipe before you have 8 shadows. You certainly wouldn't run this as your only form of removal. You would probably run something like Deathbrand for support in the early mid game, and then use this in the late game to get extreme value during a critical turn, but it's potentially extremely powerful. Overall, +1. Next up, Ghost Hound Sexton. 2 mana 2/2, fanfare, all other allied followers in play will be destroyed instead when being banished. All other allied followers that come into play will be destroyed instead of being banished. It's anti-Haven Runecraft tech. The way this is printed with all the text being on the same line as the fanfare makes it seem like this is an infinite effect, so every follower you play for the rest of the game will be destroyed instead of being banished, which would be extremely powerful. But there's also a possibility that this is a typo and it's supposed to be 2 separate lines, meaning the fanfare is all other allied followers in play will be destroyed instead of being banished. And then the part that follows, where the followers that come into play, is only while this minion is on the board. So it's hard to review this without knowing if it's printed properly or not, but it should be a good card either way, because it is a fanfare effect, not just an aura effect. So if you had Mordecai and you're in a matchup against Havencraft, you could wait until turn 10, and then you could play Mordecai and Ghost Hound on the same turn, and then the fanfare would be applied to Mordecai so that he couldn't be banished, even if Ghost Hound got removed from the board, but that would only work once. If it's an infinite effect, then you could play Ghost Hound on turn 2, Mordecai on turn 8, and then no matter how many times Mordecai got removed from the board, he would still stick around because he's being destroyed over and over again instead of being banished, which would be really good. So the overall score depends on how this card works. If it's an aura effect while Ghost Hound is on the board, I would give it a +1. If it's an infinite effect, I would have to give this a +3, because really that does a whole lot for Shadowcraft. That changes the entire game. But Shadowcraft is at the bottom of the competitive tier list, so it really does need some support, and this would be extremely useful. And last up for Shadowcraft, Nephthys? Not sure how you pronounce that. Looks like Nephthys though. 8 mana 5/5, fanfare, randomly put followers of different costs, excluding Nephthys, from your deck into play until your area is full, then destroy those followers. This is a very weird card. First off, it's an 8 mana 5/5, which means you really need to put its effect to use. You can't just expect to get a few extra shadows and maybe a card draw from Skullcradle Widow and call it a day. You really need to get good value out of this. So it's a bit difficult to evaluate, especially now without seeing the rest of the cards in the set, but the effect can surprisingly be controlled fairly well because it does put followers of different costs onto the board. So while building your deck, you can influence which followers this card pulls. And I did a little bit of math, but there are obviously a lot more applications for this card. If you curve out minions from turns 1 to 5, and then put in Mordecai on 8 mana, or a single other late game minion like Undead King, and you have an empty board when you play this card, you have about a 66% chance of pulling Mordecai or Undead King. If you skip one of those mana points, like for example if you curve from 2 mana to 5 mana, and then put in an 8 mana Mordecai, then you have an 80% chance of pulling him. So in addition to putting a 5/5 on the board, you can also get out a Mordecai and possibly some other effects, like obviously generating some shadows, drawing a card from Skullcradle Widow, spawning skeletons, spawning zombies, giving ward if you have Ghost Rider in your deck, deal 2 damage if you have Rabbit Necromancer in your deck. It's just a cornucopia of effects. And of course, if there's a good last words minion in this set that we haven't seen yet, along the lines of Mordecai that can close out a game, then you could build the deck around that too. Overall, this is a very difficult card to evaluate, especially without seeing the rest of the set. I'm going to give it a +1 for potential, but it could easily be a +2 or a 0 or maybe even a -1 if it ended up flopping. It's hard to tell. I think it has some potential though. Onto Swordcraft. We have Samurai, 2 mana 2/2, Fanfare, gain +1/+1 and Bane if 3 or more enemy followers are in play. On the minus side, this is a vanilla minion if you play it on curve, although it is still an officer, so it does get officer buffs. On the plus side, it's a decent evo target for 2 mana. If the effect procs, you would end up with a 5/5 rush Bane minion. Pretty good. Overall, the fact that it's vanilla on curve and the effect might not proc though, the overall score is just going to be 0. Next up, Fangblades Slayer, 8 mana 3/8, Bane Rush. When this follower attacks an enemy follower, deal X damage to the enemy leader. X equals this follower's attack. This is a pretty good late game control card. It has trade-offs with Alexander, however. While this is guaranteed to destroy a medium or large threat and deal face damage, Alexander can clean up a lot of small threats, so it has its pros and cons. Overall it evens out, so I'll give it a 0. Onto the neutrals, Gourmet Emperor Kaiza, 3 mana 2/2, Fanfare, put an ultimate carrot into your hand. And an ultimate carrot is a 2 mana 2/2, last words, put an ultimate carrot into your hand. So we have an infinite value card in the neutral set now. You play Kaiza, the carrot is put into your hand, you play the carrot, when the carrot dies, the carrot goes back to your hand, and you can keep repeating that as long as the carrot doesn't get banished. This also curves very well into Erd if you play it on turn 5. On turn 5 you play the 3 mana Kaiza, it immediately puts the 2 mana carrot into your hand, and you play that as well. Then on turn 6, if your carrot was killed, you play the carrot first and then Erd. Or if your carrot was not killed, you Erd the carrot that's already on the board, and then you play the carrot that gets put in your hand for a double carrot action. And then your carrot army begins. Overall, it's an infinite value card, but it is rather low impact, so I'll give it a +1 for potential. Next, Goblin Mage. Fanfare, put a random 2 playpoint follower from your deck into your hand. This is a very specific fetch card with a lot of potential, so I'm going to give it a +1. And finally, Sahakiel, 7 mana 4/4 legendary. Fanfare, put a neutral follower from your hand into play, give it rush, and then return it to your hand at the end of your turn. Right off the bat, without seeing the rest of the set, I can say for absolute certainty, winner for most adorable Rise of Bahamut card. It's going to be hard to top that. As for the effect, it has very high potential for combos, but as of right now, aside from just using the rush follower for removal, the only real combos right now are getting Gilgamesh out for 5 damage. Lucifer has potential, assuming his heal goes off before he gets put in your hand, which isn't very likely. Usually cards proc in order of left to right on your board, as in the first played to the last played. So when this puts a follower on your board, it will probably put it on the right, and then Sahakiel will proc first and put the card in your hand before it gets to proc. So Lucifer is not likely to be a combo. There's also Reyna if you want to put her in the deck. You can get Reyna out, evolve Reyna, and then Reyna will evolve Sahakiel, and it will be kind of like a Neptune effect for 7 mana, except Reyna goes back into your hand when you're done. Overall, a lot of potential, but not many existing combos right now, so we'll give it a +1 for now, but possibly a +2 in the future, depending on what cards get released. And that's all for now. Hope you found this enjoyable and informative. Thank you all for watching, and have a good night.